moving along, looking at the Latin words. So obviously, the Bible is written, first of all, in Hebrew, then in Aramaic a little bit, and then in Greek. But Latin became very important very early on in the church, and the official translation of the Catholic Church is the Latin Vulgate, and it's really influenced a lot of our theological vocabulary, including the way we talk about covenant. And there are two words in Latin that are used for covenant. The first of these that you'll find, and both of them are very, very legal. So part of what I'm saying is one of the struggles with talking about covenant is our vocabulary. And even the vocabulary that's in the Bible often has a legal veneer that you kind of have to scrape off to really get at the Hebraism beneath it. So when we get to the Greek, and then especially with the Latin, it kind of obscures the Hebraic original thoughts about covenant. And that's kind of what we're wanting to deal with in these modules. So the two words for covenant in Latin are testamentum and fidus. Let's talk about fidus a little bit first. A fidus is really the same as a treaty. It's and this becomes a dominant way of thinking about the covenant, especially after the Reformation. Just kind of a wooden, going with the word and its meaning in legal context sort of way. Martin Luther got a lot of mileage out of this understanding of covenant, of the fidus, when he comes up with his doctrine of the atonement, which is very, very legal. If you know anything about Martin Luther and his doctrine of salvation, soteriology, he says that basically what happens in the atonement is that Jesus, when he dies, he satisfies God's wrath against us, and so delivers us from the legal consequences of our sin. So he stands basically in our stead and takes our place and receives the punishment that was coming to us for our guilt. So this is what is called the forensic doctrine of the atonement. There is something similar. This is based on a certain understanding of Anselm. It's not completely wrong, and yet it's missing something. I think as Catholics, you cannot just run with Luther's doctrine of the atonement. It needs more to flesh it out. But he really focuses on this legal understanding of atonement, and it's rooted, I think, I would argue, in a misunderstanding of covenant. If you think of a covenant as a legal treaty, as a peace treaty between two parties that are at war with each other, then this is going to make more sense. If a covenant is something richer than that, then it's not going to work as well. Fidus comes to be the basis for a very very prolific body of Protestant theology called covenant theology. You may have heard that phrase, covenant theology. It does not mean what we're going to talk about for the rest of this module. Protestant covenant theology and Catholic covenant theology are kind of like oil and water. They don't mix really well. And it's because Protestant covenant theology is all based on this fidus idea of covenant, of really a legal treaty, a document that is satisfied by Jesus' atonement on the cross in a legal sense. There's a real strong focus on the legality of what happens there. And Mendenhall comes from this tradition, and that's why the suzerainty treaty appeals to him so much, in my opinion. The other thing, so the other word that we use, testamentum, that's a word that we use today in our for our Bible, of course, Old and New Testament, but even also in legal terms. We talked about wills. So a last will and testament comes from this Latin word testamentum. And so that's the word that becomes associated with a covenant. It's used to translate the Athiki. And for better or for worse, we have this long, strong legal tradition associated with covenant through all of these. Some of the other things, before we continue here, Mendenhall is also influenced by a kind of apologetics, an apologetic motive. He wants to show that the Old Testament is older than a lot of the critics at his time are saying. So at the time that Mendenhall is writing, there were a lot of critics who were trying to say that Moses had never existed, even, that he was just kind of a fictional character. There's nothing actually behind the Bible at all, no historical basis, and actually that most of it was composed after the Babylonian exile. So after really in the 400s BC, like the oldest text of the Old Testament, they were pushing them back that far. And when he discovered the suzerainty treaties, he's not the one who discovered them, but he's the one who made that personal discovery and made this connection. So when he first comes upon these, he was delighted because of their antiquity. This could demonstrate that Moses is using this framework that is much, much older than the 5th century BC. That goes way back to actually the 15th century BC. And fundamentalists, extremely conservative Christians, like to put the Old Testament, the Exodus from Egypt in the 15th century BC, actually. There's some problems with that. I'm not going to get into those. But that's part of his motivation for making this connection. I would say forcing a connection between the suzerainty treaties and the covenants of the Bible.